Himalayas. I'm also going to talk quite specifically a little bit about problems associated with landslides and roads, a little bit about landslides and dams, and a little bit about landslides and earthquakes, all in the Himalayan context. So you may be aware that a lot of the material that I'm going to talk about here is on a website that I run through the American Geophysical Union. So if you do an internet search for landslide blog, you will find almost all of the stuff that I talk about here on there. And I will put this presentation on that site as well, so that you can access it if you wish. So one of the things that me and my team have done for quite a long time, actually about 14 years now, is we've tried to look at people being killed by landslides around the world. And in 2011, we published a paper which examined the occurrence of fatal landslides globally in the period from 2004 to 2010. And what we found was that over this period, more than 80,000 people died from landslides. Now, actually, quite a lot of those, about 47,000, were killed in landslides triggered by earthquakes. But about 32,000 were landslides that weren't caused by earthquakes. And we found, in total, more than 2,600 different landslide events that caused those deaths. So the kind of key point that I want to make here is that actually, if you compare this loss for landslides with the UN data for losses from river floods, what you find is that in fact more people die in landslides than die in river floods. So it is commonly thought that rivers kill lots of people and landslides don't. But actually landslides kill more people than rivers do. And despite that, there is a lot more research on rivers than there was on landslides. So what we also did in this study is we mapped where landslides kill people around the world. And you find, so each dot here is a single landslide that killed at least one person. Some of them killed one person. Some of them killed 300 people. Some of them killed 2,000 people. No indication on the map in terms of the number of fatalities per landslide, but this is the distribution. And so what you find is that the distribution is very uneven around the Earth. There are actually not many people killed in landslides in Europe. And there are very large numbers of people killed by landslides in Asia. And in fact, Asia is pretty much the global hotspot for landslide fatalities. So if you're interested in landslides, and in particular in reducing losses from landslides, Asia is really where you should work. So if we zoom into Asia, actually you find that the pattern is a little bit more nuanced than you might expect. And in fact, really, there are a series of different zones in which there are significant landslide losses, and I'll talk about these in a moment. But actually, what you see is if Asia is the kind of global landslide hotspot, then the Himalayas are actually absolutely the center of the action. You can see that the density of spots in the Himalayas is more than the density of spots anywhere else on the Earth's surface. So actually, more people are killed by landslides in the Himalayas than anywhere else on the Earth's surface. And despite that, there is very little research activity on landslides in the Himalayan region. And this is why, for nearly 20 years, I've been interested in working on landslide problems in this part of the world. Now, actually, you could do some interesting things about trying to explain the distribution. So let me just start off with East Asia. So East Asia also has a very terrible landslide problem. And you can see that actually China is a country with very significant landslide problems, as is the Philippines and Taiwan and Japan. And we can explain this distribution quite easily. The first thing is that if you map on where the major boundaries from the tectonic plates lie, actually you see that there are nearly always landslides along these boundaries. So this is the Philippine Sea Plate. It is coming this way and colliding with Eurasia. And where we have landmass on the collision zone, you have landslides here, here, and here. So you then see that you effectively have two zones of landslides in East Asia. One is associated with this collision zone, and actually most of these landslides are triggered by tropical cyclones, by typhoons. So this zone that I've coloured yellow is the typhoon zone. So these are where we have typhoons coming ashore, creating very high amounts of rainfall, and then as a result of that, we have the triggering of the landslide. And then over here in China, we have another tectonic collision. Actually, this is the very edge of the Himalayan collision zone. And at the edge of the Himalayan zone, we also have a concentration of landslides, and these are triggered by the monsoon. So we have monsoon landslides and typhoon landslides, and dominated by these two tectonic collision zones, which basically create the terrain, which means that landslides can happen. So now, if you think about it, you can immediately explain the distribution of landslides in South Asia, right? I actually don't probably need to explain this to you at all. I will point out that here we have North Korea, and North Korea has in our data set almost no landslides. That is not because there are no landslides in North Korea. It is actually because we don't know about landslides in North Korea, and it's a point about sharing of information. In North Korea there is no sharing of information, and so we have a bit of a gap in our data here. So if we come to South Asia, I'll pick out just a few interesting things. So you see, India has a very significant landslide problem, as does Nepal. Actually, the landslides sort of split into two zones. So we have a zone of landslides in the very southwest of India, and we have the landslides that lie along the edge, the southern edge of the Himalayan arc, right away from Bangladesh through Bhutan, through India and Nepal, and into Pakistan. We have landslides along the whole of this collision zone. And of course, these landslides are caused by the tectonic collision between the Indian subplate and Eurasia. The green line is essentially the major fault, which is defining this collision zone, and the landslides actually concentrate very nicely on the fault line. And then, of course, the triggering is the monsoon, the summer monsoon. And the summer monsoon, of course, starts out in the ocean, sweeps ashore. We get a line of landslides when it meets the coast, and then as the monsoon swings northwards, we then get a line of landslides, which is dominated by that monsoon rainfall. And if you map out the intensity of monsoon, or the total monsoon rainfall, what you find is that from the east towards the west, the volume of rainfall declines, so it is wetter in the east than it is in the west, and you will also see that the landslide density decreases as the rainfall intensity decreases as you move towards the west. It is quite interesting actually that you also pick out landslides quite a long way into the Himalayas in Pakistan that you don't see further to the east, and this is of course because there are roads that go right up into the high mountains here, the Karakoram Highway for example, so there are more people up here, and so we see more landslides killing people as well. So let me just show you, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Nepal, because Nepal is somewhere that I've done, well, most of my work. So one of the things we did for Nepal is we looked at when the landslides happened. So what we've done is to divide the year into 5-day blocks. So there are 73 5-day blocks. Those blocks are called pentas, technically. And we've just mapped out the number of landslides we see in each 5-day block from January to December. And the pattern is very, very clear, right? That you see almost no landslides occurring in the first half of the year in Nepal. And then around about day 160, we start to see landslides happening. The number increases very fast through to in July, peaks, and then comes down much more slowly. And then at the back end of the year, we sort of see almost no landslides happening at all. So it is a very uneven distribution, with nearly all of the landslides occurring in this short, about 4-month period. And of course, this is absolutely the influence of the monsoon. So we see the dominance of the monsoon, and even the monsoon pattern. So the monsoon comes on quite quickly, and it declines quite slowly. So you see the peak coming up very quickly and declining quite slowly. And of course, what this tells us is that the pattern of landslides we might expect is going to be very much dominated by the future pattern of the monsoon. So if the monsoon climate changes, then the pattern of landslides will change to reflect that. So I think it is a key area for us in the future is to try to understand how the monsoon is going to change if we want to understand how landslides triggering is going to change in this area. So let me just show you some global data. So I'm going to show you data from 2004 to 2011, and this is the number of landslides that occur through the year. And what I've done again is to divide the year into 5-day blocks and then plot them sequentially. So I'm going to play this like an animation, okay? And this is global, okay? Completely global data about the number of landslides occurring. I'm going to play the first half and then I'll stop it and just talk, and then I'll play the second half. And what I want you to do is to watch the pattern. It's quite interesting. Okay, so I'll start now. So this is basically going through a 4-year period, and just the number of landslides happening. And what you should see is that each year we get landslides happening more or less constantly through the year. But each year, on a global basis, we suddenly see a spike each year. And I call this as being like the heartbeat of landslides. You know, if you watch one of those instruments that monitor your heartbeat, what you see is it goes doo-doo, 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 like that, as your heart is beating. Well, on the annual cycle with landslides, you see exactly the same thing. So you get this sudden spike each year. So let me play the second half and you'll see it. So there. So actually, this is the summer monsoon dominating the global pattern of landslides. And what you should also see is that the size of the spike and actually the shape of the spike differs from year to year on a global basis. And this is actually the pattern of the South Asian monsoon each year changes, and so we see a different spike occurring each year on year. So absolutely, the pattern of landslides that we see in the world is dominated by what is happening primarily in India.
So can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Is this the global scenario?
This is global. Yeah. And so what I've done here is that I've just highlighted the peak, and the peak is of course the peak of the monsoon in South Asia each year. So in fact, if you aggregate all of that together and just look at the annual global cycle, you see this effect of the monsoon. So this is just again going through the year from start to finish, an approximate background rate, and then the monsoon coming on and the number of landslides going up. This monsoon is dominated by, there's 2 monsoons. One is South Asia and the other is East Asia. So there's 2 monsoons occurring simultaneously, and that is absolutely dominating the landslide pattern that we see for the world in the data. So, and again, you see quite a quick rise and a much more gentle decline, which is the monsoon coming on quickly and then declining slowly. So, if you then just kind of aggregate the data across everything, what you see is this is the number of people being killed by landslides in the world from 2003 to 2011. What you see is there are 2 big spikes. And the 2 big spikes are the 2 big earthquakes. So this is the Pakistan earthquake, and this is the China earthquake. Each of those earthquakes killed more than 20,000 people in landslides. So they triggered landslides that killed hundreds of people. If you take the earthquakes out, this is the pattern from 2003 to 2011, and you see typically the number of people killed by landslides is somewhere between about 2,000 and about 6,000 people in landslides that aren't triggered by earthquakes. This is the pattern of fatality. So this is the number of people being killed each month, and you see that the spike is in September. So more people are killed in landslides in September than in any other month. And this is when the landslides themselves happen. And in fact, the peak in the landslide occurrence is in July. People always say, well, why is the peak in landslide occurrence in July, but more people are killed in September? And that is because the majority of the landslides happen in South Asia, but those landslides tend to kill relatively small numbers of people each. The peak in September is because the peak in landslides in China occurs at that time, and although there are fewer landslides, they tend to kill more people in each event. So what you're seeing here is this is dominated by the South Asian monsoon, and this is dominated by the East Asian monsoon, simply because there are more people living in the mountains of China than there are living in the mountains of the Himalayas. And you can see some other kind of interesting effects. So this is data for Sichuan province, and this is just the cumulative number of people being killed by landslides in this part of China. And see, what you see is that it was going up approximately constantly until the 2008 earthquake. And after the 2008 earthquake, the number of people being killed in landslides, rainfall-induced landslides, has increased significantly. So the earthquake has destabilized the slopes and made them more likely to have landslides. So, I've talked a little bit about just general patterns, and what I suppose the take-home message from here is just how important this region is for landslides. I mean, this, as I said, is the kind of global hotspot for landslide occurrence. Let me now talk a little bit about roads. So I want to show you why we are convinced that one of the major problems for landslides in this region is road construction and management of roads. So this is data for Nepal, and each dot here is a landslide that has killed someone over a 6 or 7 year period in Nepal. And underneath is a topography map. So what you see is the Terai Plain in the south, the very high Himalaya in the north, and the middle hills district are the kind of brown colours here, the alpine height mountains, similar to the land mountains we're in right now. And what you see is that nearly all of the landslides that kill people are in this middle Himalayan region. So in other words, these are mountains that are very like the ones that we're in right now. We don't see many fatalities up in the very high mountains. We just see a few, really not very many, and we don't see very many down on the Terai Plain. Most of those are associated with cutting of slopes for festivals. So one of the things that we've done is to look at the pattern of people being killed in landslides in Nepal from 1990. This goes through to 2014. So this is the cumulative total number of people killed by landslides in Nepal. And what you should see is that if you take the period from 1990 to 2000, actually, although people were dying in landslides, the rate was quite slow. And then in around about 2000, we see a dramatic steepening. So in other words, the number of people being killed by landslides started to increase suddenly. It reduced a little bit, and now it's going quite high again. And the question is, what was the cause of this big increase in the number of people being killed by landslides? So something obviously happened in this period to change the pattern of landslides and to create a condition in which more people died. Now, this is not climate change. Okay, we've looked very carefully at whether there is a climate change signal here. We do see climate signal for Nepal, as I think you do in North India, which is that the total monsoon rainfall is slightly reducing, but the extreme events are becoming bigger and more frequent, which is bad news for landslides. But we know pretty clearly that this is not the result of climate change. This maybe, but this particular effect was not. So what we set out to do was to try to understand what it was that was driving this change. And so we were quite interested in, if this is just the number, it's the same data, but just the number of people being killed each year. So what you see is relatively small numbers through here, and then this big spike, a little bit of a decline, and then quite a large number since. Now, the first thing to say is that there is, I think, two effects happening here. The first is something very interesting happened in Nepal in this period, and that, of course, was a civil war. This was the period of Maoist uprising in Nepal, and during this period, a lot of people left the high mountain or the middle mountain areas and moved to live beside roads. And we see an increase in the number of people being killed by landslides when people go to live beside the roads. When the uprising ended and people moved back to their traditional land, the number of people being killed by landslides declines, and then it starts to come back up again. So clearly something else happened afterwards. Now, people have often said to me, well, perhaps it's just that there are more people. The population has grown. So one of the things we've looked at is if you take each landslide and work out the average number of people killed in each landslide, does that change with time? Because if there are more people in the landscape, you might think that the average number of people being killed by landslides will have increased with time. And what you see is that although it's quite variable, there is no trace. So we don't think it's just that there were more people around. We think it's more complicated than that. So let me just show you analysis of these landslides in space. So this is the distribution of the landslides with total annual rainfall, which actually is monsoon rainfall. Right? So the dark colours are where there is more rainfall, the light colours are where there is less. So what you do see is in areas where there is the most intense rainfall, we do see a higher number of landslides. Okay, so there almost certainly is an effect from rainfall. But what you see is it doesn't really explain the distribution that we see terribly well. If you take population density, again, you do see in areas where there is more population, you see more landslides killing people, you would expect that. But again, it doesn't really explain the spatial pattern terribly well. So it's not just that in places that are more densely populated, you get more landslides killing people, where it is less densely populated, you get fewer. It is more complicated than that. But if you take the density of the road network and put the landslides onto that, suddenly you find a really good correlation. So actually, there is a strong relationship between the density of the road network. This is the orange lines here are the roads, and the grey areas behind is the density of the roads. And if I just take the road network off, what you see is actually a fantastic correlation between the road network and the landslides that kill people. So actually, the most important statistical factor to explain the landslides that we see that are killing people is actually where we build roads. And so road building is a key process in triggering landslides. And so in fact, the best algorithm you can produce to explain the distribution is the slope angle. So that tells you where there is landscape, which you can have landslides, times the total annual precipitation, times the road network density, and that pretty much explains the distribution of the landslides perfectly. So the key factor actually that has triggered this big increase in landslide fatalities over the last 10 years or so is that in the fall there has been a huge amount of completely uncontrolled road construction, and it is that road construction that is causing landslides that kill people. And I just show you this picture, which is I think a very nice example of this. So here we have a highway. In constructing the highway, they have cut away at the bottom of the slope. The slope is a big active landslide. So you can see there is a big active landslide coming through here. In cutting away the bottom of the slope, they triggered a slope failure, initial slope failure here. And what you can see is that there was a house here and there was a house here. Both of those houses were destroyed and the occupants were killed in the landslide that was triggered by or caused by the road, but triggered by heavy rainfall. And what you're now left with is a situation in which there is a big area of unstable land that is moving, that still has population living at the bottom. So in other words, we were waiting to see another road-based landslide at this location. This is a typical pattern that we see all over Nepal associated with road construction. I also just wanted to say a little bit about large dams. So I did a keynote lecture about 3 years ago for a conference that was held in Italy, which was to commemorate a dam disaster that happened in the north of Italy in 1963. So 3 years ago was the 50th anniversary. This is called the Vajont landslide, and it was a landslide on the banks of a reservoir. So the reservoir was constructed, and a landslide was triggered on the banks of the reservoir, came into the lake. And the landslide triggered a wave that went over the top of the dam and hit the village below, and it killed 2,200 people. It is the biggest landslide disaster known landslide disaster in European history, and it was associated with a large dam. And so what I was interested in is what has happened since in terms of landslides and large dams. And there is a database, actually, a United Nations database, which is of large dams, and the red dots here is the distribution of large dams across the world in the UN large dam database from 2012. What you see is that there are quite a lot of large dams, a very large number indeed. But it is quite interesting actually that if you look at the UN large dam database, what you see is although there are vast numbers, in Europe and in North America and in South Africa, you see in particular that the number that are in the Himalayas and the number that is in the Andes is quite small. There aren't very many large dams in this region. So if you just take the density of large dams in space, which is what the red area is here, what you see is you see actually the place with the biggest density of large dams is in Japan. You see there's quite a lot in China, and you see that the density in the Andes and the Himalayas is surprisingly low. And of course the point is that we are just putting that right at the moment. We are constructing significant numbers of large dams at present in this region. And that is quite interesting because what you see is, in particular in the Himalayas, we have lots of fatality-inducing landslides, but very few large dams at the moment. And now we are constructing large dams, and large dams, if they're not constructed properly, are quite good at triggering landslides. So my question was, what is the potential risk of building large dams in this effectively new area? So what I did is then superimpose these two together. So the black dots here are where landslides kill people, and the red areas is the density of large dams. And what you see is that there is this kind of very interesting correlation that where we built large dams previously, on the whole are not areas where landslides kill large numbers of people. But now we are just starting to build large dams in areas where landslides do kill large numbers of people. And that's a kind of interesting experiment that we're going through. So then I looked at large dams completed since 1990, and what you start to see is that since 1990 there are just a small number of white dots starting to appear in the Himalayas. So we are starting to build large dams in this area, and also of course in the Andes. And so what I then did was went back through the data set we've been collecting since 2002, and I looked for landslides associated with large dams between 2003 and 2012. And what I found was that in the period from 2003 to 2012, there have been 37 landslide events associated with large dams. And those landslide events have killed about 500 people so far in that period, 2003 to 2012. So actually we are starting to see landslides being associated with large dams in a way that we've not seen previously. So if you map this with time, so from 2003 to 2012, what you see is that actually there is an increasing rate of the number of people being killed in landslides associated with large dams. In fact, 2007 was a particularly bad year. But if you just compare the number in the period 2003 to 2006 with 2008 to 2012, what you see is actually they are much more prevalent since 2007 onwards. So in other words, we are starting to see landslides associated with large dams. So what I then did was to look at what are these landslides that are killing people from large dams? And what you find is that actually 17 of them were landslides that happened during construction. So during the construction phase of the dam, a landslide happened that killed people. There were 11 associated with landslides that went into and hit a camp for either the workers or a village in the local area. There were 5 landslides on the construction roads for large dams, and then various others. Only one of these was a landslide into a lake. So we are seeing significant numbers, but most of them are actually occurring during the construction phase of the dam. So I then just went back and looked at the countries. And this is what the data shows. So if we cross this period, 16 of these landslides occurred in China, and 10 of these landslides occurred in India. So actually, what we are seeing is an interesting effect whereby actually in both China and in India, we are starting to see quite substantial numbers of landslides associated with the construction of large dams. And we are seeing actually quite large numbers of fatalities occurring as a result of this. And my sense is that this may be an indication that we're starting to construct dams in areas that we understand the landslides much less well. And the consequence is we are seeing a bigger landslide problem. And I think, although I'm not indicating that we are heading for another Viance-type disaster, I do think it would be sensible for us to make sure that we understand the landslides properly in this kind of setting whilst we build these large dams. Because to me, seeing landslides occurring during the construction phase of the dams would suggest that maybe we don't understand the landslide problem as well as we might. And it's quite interesting actually that if you look at the time, the month of the year when these landslides happen, so this is the distribution of the occurrence of these landslides associated with large dams. And of course, because they're in China and India, nearly all of these are basically Himalayan landslides. And what you see is that the peak is in July. So in other words, it is rainfall-induced landslides that we're seeing that are the problem. They're not construction landslides. They are actually landslides that have been triggered during the construction phase, but they are rainfall-triggered landslides that are causing us the problems. And so they come on in the start of the monsoon, and when the monsoon ends, the landslides more or less end as well. So if you just map out the distribution of landslides associated with large dams, each dot here is a landslide with a large dam in the period from 2003 to 2012. What you see is that they are really in this part of the world that the problem is not occurring. So I think there is some interesting questions to ask about making sure that we're controlling landslides properly during the construction of large dams. And I thought I'd just finish off by talking about the Nepal earthquake, because I said actually that the largest numbers of fatalities in landslides are associated with earthquakes. And so we actually understand the Nepal earthquake pretty well now. So this is a map which has been constructed with radar satellites, and it's imaging the area that we know changed during the Nepal earthquake. So here is Kathmandu. So this is the area just to the north of Kathmandu. This is Everest over here. And this is where the epicenter of the earthquake lay. And this area of colour fringes, this is area of change of the ground's topography that we know that was caused by the earthquake. And actually what happened, this area here, which is the high mountain area, subsided by about 1 metre in the earthquake. And Kathmandu came up by about 1 metre in the earthquake. And the colour fringe here is part of the fault that under the ground ruptured to generate this magnitude 7.8 earthquake. Actually, it's quite a small section, smaller than we'd anticipated, and the rupture of the fault doesn't even reach the frontal thrust, and the vertical thrust comes up to the surface. So we now know pretty much exactly what happened during this earthquake. We know where the fault ruptured, when the fault ruptured. It started over here and it moved this way. Each of these little circles here is an aftershock. This is the big magnitude 7.3 aftershock that occurred on the 12th of May. This is the main shock that occurred on 25th of April. You probably felt both of these events here quite strongly, I would suspect. The earthquake triggered landslides. It did, and this is a photograph of one of the landslides as it happened at Durham. There's quite a few videos of these landslides happening, and you can see that many of them were really very dramatic, generated a large amount of dust, and there were quite a lot of fatalities. So I'm involved in a UK research project called Earthquake Without Frontiers. And one of the things that we set out to do after the Nepal earthquake was to map the distribution of landslides. And this map here is the landslide density within the zone that was affected by the earthquake. So I realise that it might be difficult for you to see everything here, but Kathmandu is just here. This is the epicenter over here. And this is, if you know it, this is Manachap over here, and this is Durham, where that photograph was taken. So the kind of cold and warm colours up here are the area of landslides that were triggered by the earthquake. And you see that there's actually two areas of significant landslides. There is one out over in the west, and there is one in the east. In fact, the amount of landsliding that occurred in most of the Himalayan middle hills was much lower than we had anticipated. We know why that is now. In fact, we know why Kathmandu suffered much less badly in the earthquake, which is that the earthquake rupture, the event that caused the earthquake to be generated, happened in a way that wasn't anticipated and was unusual. And so the ground shaking that we saw in this earthquake was much lower than we expected, except in this northern zone. So the landslides here are picking out the zone where we had very intense ground shaking. In the south, the ground shaking was much lower than we expected, which is why Kathmandu was nothing like as badly damaged as we had anticipated it would be in an earthquake like this. But there are some very significant landslide events. So this is the biggest. In fact, this was the biggest single fatality event in the Gorkha earthquake in Nepal. So this was the village of Langtang. Langtang was a trekking village. There were about 250 houses and hotels at Langtang. And this is the aftermath of the landslide that hit Langtang, and this is the village centre. Okay, so what you should be able to see is that in fact the village was completely wiped out. And this was wiped out by a landslide that came up an adjacent slope. In fact, above the village was down here. This was a nearly vertical slope, and then there was a glacier. And at the front of the glacier was a big pile of rock and debris. And this pile of rock and debris, which was here, satellite images show us, fell off and slid. And it fell about 600 meters, hit the valley floor, exploded, and then wiped out the village in a single flow. And it killed, well, some hundred people. We don't know exactly how many. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this event, the energy that was released when the landslide mass hit the valley floor was half the energy released in the Hiroshima nuclear explosion. Okay, so half the energy from the Hiroshima nuclear explosion hit this village in one go. That was the magnitude of the landslide. And so, I point this out just to say, it's very easy to forget the very significant effect that we would see of landslides in an earthquake in the Himalayas. And about 1/3 of the fatalities that you see in a mountain zone in an earthquake are associated with landslides, of which this is the biggest type and relatively rare, but as the previous map shows you, there are many others. And so throughout this kind of northern region of Nepal, we see events like this. So it's a catastrophic destabilization of the slopes, boulders coming down and hitting vehicles and houses, and the foundation of buildings slipping, and so the building collapsing because the ground has slipped underneath it. And in fact, this is a much bigger impact than the widely reported collapse of buildings in Kathmandu. Actually, this problem with landslides in earthquakes is quite significant, and I think it's a hazard that we underestimate, that we should take quite seriously going forward. So I just finish off with work by Roger Billum about seismic hazard across the Himalayas. Actually, this is a map that he produced prior to the Kathmandu earthquake. You may have seen it before. But essentially, this is the zone of which the plate tectonic collision is locked. In other words, where we expect earthquakes to happen. These red dots are where we've seen recent earthquakes. So out in the east here, there was an earthquake in 1950. This is the 1934 Bihar earthquake. A little bit further over, there was the 1833 earthquakes in the northern Kathmandu. And it's the zone where we don't see any recent earthquakes, where the seismic hazard is the biggest. And the length of these bars is the magnitude of the potential earthquake that we would expect to see at some point in the future along this zone. So what you see is just to the east of Kathmandu, because of the 1934 Bihar earthquake, the hazard is lower. But notice a bar of this length is still a magnitude 7.6 earthquake. That is a big earthquake. And as we come further to the east, what we see is that the potential earthquake magnitude is in the region of 8, and maybe up to around about 8.2 or 8.3 further to the east. And also to the west of Kathmandu, we see very significant seismic hazard as well. The earthquake that happened last year is just in this zone here. I think it may actually be a repeat of this 1833 earthquake. We think it may be the same section of fault that ruptured a second time. And we don't think that this earthquake has significantly reduced the hazard of an earthquake in this zone. And of course there is also the hazard of an earthquake in this zone. So in other words, when we're thinking about landslide hazard, we do need to be thinking about earthquake triggering, and earthquake triggering along the line of the Himalayas is a significant hazard all the time. So in conclusion, I've talked a little bit about why we think landslides are a significant problem in the Himalayas. I've talked a little bit about about the kind of way that the Himalayan landslide problem dominates the global pattern. I've talked a little bit about landslides and roads. We are pretty confident that roads are a major factor. Poor road construction, in particular rural roads that are built without engineering input, are a major factor in this increase in landslide occurrence that we're seeing. Talked a little bit about the interesting challenges we face around landslides and dams in this part of the world, and then finally a little bit about the hazards associated with landslides in Africa. I hope it's been of some interest. Thank you very much indeed for that.